Ethan Cole had abandoned racing, crushed by debt and haunted by a fall that stole his champion horse and his courage. His barn stood cloaked in dust, his saddle left to decay until Maya, his defiant daughter, found Rowan, a scarred stray horse with eyes blazing like they carried both their dreams. Neither could have foreseen that this fragile bond would ignite a passion strong enough to awaken an entire slumbering town. The first light of morning spilled over the rolling hills of Kentucky, painting the fields in shades of silver and pale gold. A low mist clung to the bluegrass pastures, drifting lazily across the white fences that marked the boundaries of Willow Bend, a town too small for most maps. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled deep in a man's bones, too quiet for someone who remembered the thunder of hooves and the roar of a cheering crowd. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his weather-worn barn, a faded plaid shirt pulled tight against the early chill. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth, leaving prints among the dew. The barn loomed behind him, its red paint long since flaked to gray. Inside, the stalls were empty. The air still smelled faintly of hay and leather, like a ghost refusing to leave. Against one post hung an old saddle, cracked and stiff, the stirrups rusted from years of neglect. It swung slightly when the wind slipped through the gaps in the boards, as if mocking the man who had once carried it like a crown. Ethan's eyes lingered on it longer than he wanted. He turned away, pushing his hands deep into his pockets, trying to silence the ache that rose every time he thought of who he used to be. There was a time when his name had been whispered around county fairs and small-town tracks, when he'd leaned low on a horse's back and felt like he was flying. That was before the debts, before the broken promises, before he had sworn he'd never touch the racing world again. Now, his life was measured not in laps or trophies, but in overdue bills and the endless labor of keeping his farm from crumbling. He lived one season to the next, patching fences, bargaining for hay, praying the bank would give him more time. The only reason he kept going at all was his daughter, Maya, 16 years old, stubborn as a mule, with a sketchbook always tucked under her arm. She was the only spark left in his days. Ethan squinted toward the horizon where the mist was lifting. Beyond the fields, the faint sound of a church bell rang out from town, carried on the wind. Sunday again. Another day to sit through sermons about hope and renewal, words that sounded like lies to a man who had lost too much. He sighed, pulling out a cigarette he wouldn't light. He hadn't smoked in years, but he still carried one, like a habit he couldn't bury. He rolled it between his fingers, staring at the lifeless barn. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "Dad?" Maya's voice floated out, soft but persistent. "Breakfast's getting cold." He didn't answer right away. He had never been good at words. Instead, he glanced once more at the saddle swaying on the post before turning toward the house. Maya was waiting on the porch, her dark hair pulled back into a messy braid, her eyes too bright for this world. She studied him the way she always did, like she could see right through the walls he'd built. "You were looking at it again, weren't you?" she said, her lips quirking. Ethan frowned, tugging at his sleeve. "Just checking the barn." Maya tilted her head, unconvinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she smiled gently, holding the door open. "Come on, Dad," Ruth Ann said. "She's baking pies today. We should stop by after church." Ethan grunted something between agreement and reluctance. Ruth Ann had been his friend since childhood, a woman who mothered half the town whether they asked for it or not. She meant well, but she had a way of dragging the past into the present, and that was the last thing he wanted. Still, he followed Maya inside. The kitchen was warm with the smell of biscuits and eggs, a stark contrast to the damp chill outside. He sat at the table, watching her bustle around, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. She was the only one who could make him sit still these days. She carried a piece of her mother's softness in her, though her mother had been gone a long time now. As he ate, his mind wandered back to the barn, to the saddle swaying in the dark. It was foolish, he told himself, to keep it hanging there like some kind of shrine. Yet he couldn't bring himself to throw it out. Maybe it was because part of him still needed to believe that what he'd lost wasn't gone forever. After breakfast, they climbed into the old pickup, its engine coughing to life like an old man clearing his throat. The road into town wound past fields and fences, past neighbors who waved from their porches. Willow Bend might have been small, but it carried history in every weather-beaten board and every church steeple that pierced the sky. At church, Ethan sat stiffly in the pew, listening half-heartedly as the preacher spoke of faith, of storms giving way to sunlight. Maya sang the hymns with the rest of the congregation, her voice clear, her eyes alight. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the stained glass, where colored light fell across his calloused hands. Words like redemption and forgiveness rolled off the preacher's tongue, but Ethan felt them bounce off his chest like stones against armor. After the service, they stopped by Ruth Ann's diner. The place smelled of coffee and sugar, with the clatter of dishes and the murmur of familiar voices filling the air. Ruth Ann herself bustled behind the counter, her silver hair pulled into a bun, her smile as wide as the sky. "Well, if it isn't Ethan Cole," she teased, sliding 2 slices of pie onto the counter. "And Maya, sweetheart, you're blooming like a wildflower. Sit, sit." Ethan tried to decline, but Ruth Ann had never been the type to take no for an answer. She plunked down a steaming cup of coffee in front of him and leaned her elbows on the counter. Her eyes, sharp despite the crow's feet, studied him the way only someone who'd known him since childhood could. "You look tired," she said softly, almost to herself. "Same tired I saw back when you used to ride." Ethan stiffened. He opened his mouth to protest, but Ruth Ann raised a hand, cutting him off. She reached behind the counter, pulling out an old, framed photograph. She set it down between them. It was a picture of Ethan, 20 years younger, his face lit with joy, riding a powerful bay horse through the finish line of the county fair race. The crowd blurred behind him, but Ethan's smile was sharp and clear. He looked like a man who believed in the impossible. Maya leaned closer, her eyes wide. "Is that you, Dad?" Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it, to push the picture away, but Ruth Ann's steady gaze pinned him in place. "That boy had fire," Ruth Ann said, tapping the glass. "And I don't believe fire like that dies. It just waits for the right wind." Ethan stared at the photograph, the weight of memory pressing heavy on his chest. He reached for his coffee, but his hand trembled, and he set the cup down without drinking. Maya looked between her father and the photo, something sparking in her expression. Her lips parted, as if she were about to say something important, but the bell over the diner door jingled, and a man stepped inside, shaking rain from his hat. The moment passed, but the thought lingered in her eyes. Ethan turned away, his jaw clenched. He had spent years burying the past, yet here it was again, dragged into the light. He didn't want to feel the pull of it. He didn't want to remember what it was like to fly. But deep down, as he stared at that old photograph, he knew the truth. The fire Ruth Ann spoke of wasn't gone. It was smoldering, waiting, and all it would take was a spark to set it ablaze again. The rain that had threatened on Sunday afternoon broke loose overnight, washing the fields in silver streaks. By morning, the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that made everything smell fresh but left the ground muddy underfoot. Maya Cole tugged on her boots at the porch and slung her sketchbook under her arm, ignoring her father's call from the kitchen. She needed air. More than that, she needed space from the heaviness that clung to Ethan since Ruth Ann had put that old photograph in front of him. Maya had seen something flicker in her father's eyes when he looked at the picture, something sharp and alive, then gone in a blink. She couldn't name it, but it stayed with her, the way certain dreams do even after you wake. She wanted to understand that piece of him, the piece he kept locked away, as if it was too painful to remember. She followed the gravel road past the pastures and down toward the edge of town, where the county maintained a modest animal shelter on donated land. Most people thought of it as a place for stray dogs and cats, but Maya knew they sometimes took in larger animals too, goats, sheep, and, on rare occasions, horses. The chain-link gate clattered as she pushed it open. A volunteer waved absently, too busy wrangling a pair of barking hounds to notice her slip by. Maya's boots squelched in the wet ground as she made her way toward the farthest paddock, where a small group of horses grazed listlessly. Most were older, sway-backed and slow, but one figure stood apart. He was thinner than the others, his ribs faintly visible beneath a dull coat the color of dark mahogany. His mane hung uneven, tangled by wind and rain, and one hind leg bore the faint outline of an old scar. But it was his eyes that caught Maya still. They were deep, the kind of eyes that seemed to carry stories, the kind that looked right through a kind person. Maya froze, sketchbook clutched against her chest. Something about him felt different. Not just sad, not just abandoned, but waiting. She took a cautious step forward, whispering without realizing it. "Hey there." The horse's ears flicked back, then forward again, testing her voice. He shifted his weight, stamping lightly in the mud, uncertain. When she reached the fence, Maya rested her palms on the cool metal and leaned in, holding her breath as if any sudden movement might break the moment. "Don't be scared," she murmured, her voice trembling with excitement. The horse took one step closer, his hooves sinking into the muck. Another step, slower, measured, his head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring as he drew in her scent. Then, to Maya's astonishment, he stopped directly before her, so close that the heat of his breath touched her fingers. Maya extended her hand, her heart pounding. She expected him to shy away, to toss his head like the others had when she'd tried before. Instead, the horse stood still, his dark eyes steady on hers. Carefully, gently, she brushed her fingers against the damp skin between his nostrils. It was as if the world went silent. No barking dogs, no clatter of gates, just the steady warmth of connection. Maya gasped softly. "You're beautiful," she whispered, though to anyone else he might have looked broken. Behind her, a voice startled her from the moment. "You got away with him," a man said. Maya spun around to see Caleb Whitford, the town's farrier, leaning on the fence with his usual air of quiet watchfulness. His broad shoulders filled out his worn jacket, and his hands, scarred and blackened from years of hammering steel, rested casually on the rails. "Most folks can't get near that one," Caleb continued. "Came off the track a while back. Too many starts, not enough care. They were going to sell him off, but he ended up here instead." Maya turned back toward the horse, her hand still resting on his muzzle. "What's his name?" Caleb shrugged. "Rowan, I think, though names don't mean much if no one calls him." Maya frowned, stroking the damp fur. "Rowan," she said softly, testing the sound. The horse flicked an ear, as if he heard. Caleb studied her for a long moment. "Funny thing," he said. "Your daddy used to have a horse with eyes just like that. Full of fight, full of trouble too." Maya's chest tightened. "Dad doesn't talk about it." "Figures," Caleb said, straightening. "He's good at carrying silence, not so good at putting it down." Maya looked back at Rowan, feeling the weight of the man's words settle over her. She didn't know what her father had lost, not exactly, but she knew standing there with her hand against Rowan's face that maybe this horse could help her find out. The rain started again, light at first, then steady, dripping from the brim of her jacket. Rowan didn't move. He let her stay there, touching him, as if some unspoken agreement had been made. By the time she left the shelter, her boots were soaked through, and her sketchbook was damp around the edges. She didn't care. She sketched Rowan from memory as soon as she got home, every line of his thin body, the small white star on his forehead, the depth of his eyes. She tucked the drawing where her father would see it, propped against his coffee mug on the kitchen table. When Ethan came in that evening, tired from hauling bales of hay, he stopped short at the sight of the picture. He picked it up slowly, his brow furrowing. "What's this?" he asked. Maya looked up from the stove where she was stirring a pot of soup. "His name's Rowan," she said, her voice steady. I think we should bring him home." Ethan blinked at her, then at the sketch. For a moment he said nothing. He looked at the horse's drawn eyes, then out the window toward the empty barn silhouetted against the fading sky. "Maya," he began, but the words trailed off. Something flickered in his chest, something he didn't want to feel but couldn't quite push away. The fire Ruth Ann had spoken of, buried deep, stirred faintly as he stared at the lines his daughter had traced. And though he didn't know it yet, that drawing was the first spark. Monday mornings in Willow Bend always carried the hum of routine. Tractors starting up, school buses trundling down the road, and Ruth Ann's diner buzzing like a hive before most folks had even rubbed the sleep from their eyes. The smell of frying bacon drifted out the door and mixed with the crisp scent of dew and earth, drawing in farmers, truckers, and church ladies alike. Ethan Cole pushed the door open with his shoulder, the bell above it jingling softly. He didn't come here often anymore, too many watchful eyes, too much gossip, but Maya had insisted. She'd slipped the drawing of Rowan into her backpack before they left the house, her face set in that determined way he recognized all too well. She wasn't letting the idea go, not yet. The diner was warm, bright with the glow of neon signs and sunlight streaming through the big front windows. Booths were filled with familiar faces, men in ball caps nursing coffee, women in Sunday dresses still lingering from church the day before. Ruth Ann herself was behind the counter, moving with the easy grace of someone who had done this for decades. She looked up when she saw them, her face breaking into a smile that seemed to light the whole room. "Well, look who the wind blew in," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Ethan Cole, out from his cave, and Maya right behind him. "Lord, child, you get taller every time I see you," Maya grinned, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "It's the boots," she said. Ruth Ann chuckled, pouring coffee into Ethan's mug before he even asked. "Same old boots, same old man? Sit down, Ethan. You look like you haven't eaten a maggot. Real meal in weeks." Ethan muttered something non-committal, but he took the stool beside Maya. The warmth of the place seeped into him despite himself. There was something about Ruth Ann's diner, the red vinyl seats, the clatter of plates, the jukebox humming softly in the corner that made time feel slower, kinder. Maya pulled out her sketchbook, flipping to the page of Rowan. She slid it across the counter toward Ruth Ann. "I met him yesterday," she said, her voice almost breathless, "at the shelter. His name's Rowan. Isn't he something?" Ruth Ann studied the drawing for a long moment, her lips pursing. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. "You've got your daddy's eye for detail, that's for sure." Then she looked up at Ethan, her gaze sharp. "You seen this horse?" Ethan shook his head. "She's got her heart set on it, that's all." Ruth Ann didn't press further. Instead, she disappeared into the back room, her footsteps fading, then returned carrying something framed and wrapped in brown paper. She set it down on the counter with a careful touch, as though it was fragile. "I wasn't sure if I should give this back," she said, unwrapping it slowly. "But maybe it's time." The paper peeled away, revealing a photograph Ethan hadn't seen in years. His breath caught. It was him, younger by 2 decades, astride a sleek bay horse streaking across the finish line at the county fair. His face was flushed with triumph, his smile wide, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who still believed anything was possible. The crowd behind him blurred, but in the photo he was sharp, alive, untouchable. Maya leaned closer, eyes widening. "That's you," she whispered. "Dad, you look different," Ethan finished for her, his voice rough. Ruth Ann's eyes softened. "You look like a man who hadn't forgotten how to dream." Ethan tried to push the frame away, but his hands betrayed him. They lingered on. The glass, tracing the outline of the horse's powerful stride. 1,000 memories rushed in, the sound of hooves pounding dirt, the wind tearing at his shirt, the way the world narrowed down to the rhythm of a heart beneath him. He swallowed hard, setting the picture back on the counter with a thud. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Doesn't matter anymore." But Maya's eyes were shining, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "It does matter," she insisted. "You were happy. You can be again." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her she didn't understand, that dreams were luxuries for people who weren't drowning in debt and regret. But the words caught in his throat. He looked at her instead, at the fire in her expression, and saw a reflection of the very same fire he used to carry. Ruth Ann leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I know what you've been through, Ethan. But listen to me, sometimes what we bury isn't dead. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right wind." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his hand wrapping around his coffee mug. The warmth grounded him, but it didn't ease the storm in his chest. He thought of Rowan, the horse his daughter couldn't stop talking about, and the way her sketch had captured something fragile yet fierce. Maya broke the silence. "We could bring him home, Dad. The barn's empty. It wouldn't take much." Ethan's jaw clenched. "It would take more than we've got. But maybe he's like you," Maya pressed. "Maybe he just needs a chance." For a moment, the diner seemed to hold its breath. The clatter of dishes, the hum of voices, even the jukebox faded beneath the weight of her words. Ethan looked at his daughter, then at the old photograph, and for one terrifying, exhilarating second, he almost believed she was right. But belief was dangerous. Belief led to hope, and hope had betrayed him before. He set the mug down hard enough to rattle the saucer. "We're not talking about this," he said firmly. "Not now." Maya opened her mouth to argue, but the bell above the door jingled, and a gust of cool air swept through. Caleb Whitford stepped inside, his boots tracking mud across the tile. He tipped his hat at Ruth Ann, then glanced toward the counter where Ethan and Maya sat. His eyes fell on the photograph, then on Maya's sketch beside it. "Well," he said slowly, a hint of something unreadable in his voice. "Looks like the past's got a way of circling back." Ethan stiffened, the muscles in his jaw working. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken history, until Ruth Ann broke it with a clap of her hands. "Pie's on the house today," she said brightly, though her eyes stayed locked on Ethan. "Sit down, Caleb. We've got stories to remember." The following Saturday dawned cool and damp, the kind of Kentucky morning where the fog rolled thick across the fields and the air smelled of wet soil and cut grass. Ethan had been up since before sunrise, restless, pacing the porch with his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. The memory of Ruth Ann's photograph still clung to him like a shadow, and Maya's insistence about Rowan gnawed at him. He told himself it was foolish. Bringing a horse into their lives now would only mean more mouths to feed, more debts to shoulder. And yet, he hadn't thrown her sketch away. It still lay folded in his wallet, pressed between old receipts and bank notices, as if he couldn't quite let go. Maya, of course, wasn't giving up. By mid-morning, she had convinced her father to drive out to the shelter, her arguments layered with quiet persistence. Just to see him again, she'd said, and somehow Ethan had found himself behind the wheel of the pickup, gravel crunching under the tires as they pulled up to the chain-link gate. Rowan was in the paddock, head bowed as he pawed at the muddy ground. He looked even thinner in the grey light, his ribs more pronounced. But when he spotted Maya climbing the fence, his ears pricked and his head lifted. Ethan felt something twist in his chest, a tug he didn't want to acknowledge. Caleb Whitford was already there, leaning against the rail with his arms folded, watching the horse with his usual quiet intensity. He nodded at Ethan. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," Ethan muttered. Maya slipped between them, her hand already reaching for Rowan's muzzle. "He remembers me," she said, her voice glowing with triumph. Caleb studied the scene, then pushed off the fence. "If you're serious about keeping him, he's going to need work. Can't run on cracked hooves and bent shoes. You'll need a farrier before you even think about anything else." Ethan bristled. "We're not—" He stopped, catching Maya's pleading eyes. He sighed, the fight draining from him. "Fine, but just the basics, nothing fancy." Caleb didn't argue. Instead, he set to work with a kind of reverence that came from years of shaping steel and caring for animals most people had given up on. He fetched his tools from the back of his truck, the anvil scarred from decades of hammer strikes, tongs blackened with soot, and a small forge that hissed when the fire caught. The sound alone drew a small crowd from the shelter staff, curious to see the old farrier at work. Ethan stood by, arms crossed, trying to mask the strange mix of emotions stirring inside him. The clang of hammer on hot iron echoed across the yard, a sharp rhythm that awakened something deep in his memory. He remembered nights spent in barns just like this, the smell of smoke and singed metal, the nervous shifting of horses as their shoes were set. He had forgotten how much of that world had been built not just on speed, but on craft, on patience, on the small acts that kept horses sound and riders safe. Rowan snorted nervously as Caleb lifted his hoof, but Maya was there, stroking his neck, whispering into his ear. "It's okay," she said softly. "He's helping you." The horse's muscles quivered but didn't bolt. He seemed to anchor himself on her voice, steadying under her touch. Ethan watched, his throat tight. He hadn't expected Maya to have such a calming effect, hadn't realized just how much of her mother's gentleness she carried. The air filled with the smell of hot iron and burnt hoof, sharp but not unpleasant, a smell of renewal. Caleb worked with a precision born of decades, shaping, cooling, nailing, filing until the shoe fit snug and secure. When he stepped back, Rowan tested the ground, his gait steadier, his head lifting as if he sensed the change. "First horseshoe's always the hardest," Caleb said, wiping his brow. "But he'll hold. With time, he might even carry you farther than you think." Ethan looked away, unwilling to let the hope settle too deep. "We'll see," he muttered. But Maya's smile told a different story. To her, Rowan's first sure step was a promise. They walked the horse back to the barn that afternoon, Rowan's hooves clicking more evenly against the ground. The sound echoed in Ethan's chest, a rhythm he hadn't heard in years. He told himself it was just the iron, just the work of a skilled farrier. But deep down, he knew it was more. That night, after Maya had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone on the porch. The moon hung low, casting pale light across the fields. From the barn came the faint sound of Rowan shifting in his stall, the creak of wood, the soft blow of his breath. Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to ride again, not in a race, not for glory, but just to feel the wind and the earth beneath him. The thought frightened him, it thrilled him, and it wouldn't let him go. The next morning, a light breeze carried the scent of clover through the open windows of the farmhouse. Ethan had barely touched his breakfast, his mind too full of the night before, the metallic ring of Caleb's hammer, the sharp smell of burned hoof, the sight of Rowan's steadier step. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but he felt something shift deep inside him, like the loosening of a knot he'd carried for too long. Maya, meanwhile, was restless with excitement. She had been up before dawn, braiding her hair quickly, pulling on her boots, eager to get back to the barn. Her father had stalled long enough. Today, she said, Rowan needed to learn to trust more than just her touch. By the time Ethan finally relented, the sun was climbing higher, burning away the mist. They walked down to the barn together, Maya leading the way, her sketchbook bouncing against her hip. Rowan was waiting, ears flicking forward at the sound of their approach. He was calmer now, more alert, as if the new shoes on his feet had given him not just balance but confidence. Inside the barn stood Dr. Olivia Park, the town's young veterinarian. She had arrived early, called by Maya's persistence, her truck still idling outside with the words "Equine Care" stenciled on the door. Olivia was brisk, professional, her dark hair pulled back, her hands already gloved. She had the kind of energy that filled a room without raising her voice. "Morning," she greeted, her eyes scanning Rowan's frame. "He's underweight, but his bones are sound. Old scar on the left hind, but it's healed. What he needs now is conditioning. Slow, steady, no shortcuts." Ethan bristled at her tone, but before he could argue, Maya jumped in. "We can do it. I'll help." Olivia crouched, running her hands gently down Rowan's legs. The horse shifted but didn't pull away, his trust slowly building. "It won't just be feeding him right," she said. "It's about rhythm. Horses breathe with their stride. You can't push him faster than his lungs will allow." She glanced up at Ethan, her gaze sharp. "You used to know that." The words landed like a challenge. Ethan felt heat rise in his chest, though he couldn't deny the truth. Once, he had been able to read a horse's breath like a second language. He had known when to press, when to hold back, when to simply let the animal lead. That knowledge was still buried somewhere in him, though he'd spent years trying to forget. Olivia stood, brushing hay from her hands. "If you want him to heal, you'll have to find that again. Start by walking him, listening to him. Count the breaths, feel the heartbeat. That's where it begins." Maya reached for the lead rope eagerly. "Come on, Dad, we can try it now." Reluctantly, Ethan took the rope, his hand brushing against Rowan's warm neck. The horse twitched, then settled, his breath steady against the morning air. They led him out into the pasture, the grass damp with dew, the sky wide and blue above them. At first, Rowan walked stiffly, his muscles tight, but as the minutes passed, his stride loosened. Ethan kept pace, his boots sinking into the soft ground, his hand firm but gentle on the rope. He counted under his breath, matching steps to the rise and fall of the horse's ribs. 1, 2, inhale. 1, 2, exhale. Slowly, something began to align. Maya watched, her face glowing. "You see it, don't you?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer, but he felt it, the rhythm, the connection. For the first time in years, he wasn't dragging a burden behind him. He was moving with something alive, something that carried him as much as he guided it. After several laps, Rowan stopped, tossing his head, breath puffing white in the cool air. Ethan reached out, resting his palm against the horse's chest. Beneath it, the heartbeat thudded, strong, steady. He closed his eyes, letting the sound sink into him. When he opened them, Olivia was watching. "Not bad," she said, her tone softer now. "You haven't lost it completely." Ethan almost smiled, though it faded quickly. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered, handing the rope back to Maya. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. That evening, after chores were done and Maya had gone inside, Ethan lingered in the barn. The quiet wrapped around him, broken only by the shuffle of hooves and the rustle of hay. Rowan stood calm in his stall, his eyes reflecting the lantern light. Ethan leaned against the wooden rail, listening again to the rhythm of breath and heartbeat, letting it steady the storm inside him. He didn't notice Maya watching from the doorway, sketchbook in hand, her lips curved in a knowing smile. She could see what he wouldn't say out loud. Her father was changing, slowly but surely. The sky was the color of pewter when Ethan led Rowan out to the open field. A fine drizzle had begun, not enough to drench but enough to bead on skin and darken the soil. The land spread wide, the kind of expanse only Kentucky could offer, rolling green that seemed endless even under gray skies. Ethan tightened the cinch on the old saddle, a piece he hadn't touched in years, oiled hastily the night before. His hands remembered the motions even if his mind resisted them. Maya stood at the fence, her braid already damp, her eyes fixed on her father. She held her sketchbook against her chest like a shield, her excitement so raw it almost hurt Ethan to look at her. "You don't have to, Dad," she said softly, though her voice carried a tremor of hope. Ethan adjusted the stirrup, his jaw tight. If he's going to carry weight again, better it's me first than someone else. He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince her, or himself. Rowan shifted beneath him, muscles twitching as Ethan swung one leg over and settled into the saddle. The leather creaked, familiar and foreign at the same time. For a moment, he sat still, his breath shallow, his palms clammy against the reins. Memories pressed in, the thunder of hooves, the rush of wind, the crowd's roar, and then the fall, the one that had ended everything. His chest tightened, his throat constricting. But beneath him, Rowan exhaled, a slow, steady breath that misted in the cool air, rising like smoke. Ethan felt it through the horse's body, the way the ribs expanded, the chest lifted. Without meaning to, he matched it, inhaling when Rowan did, exhaling in rhythm. "Easy," Ethan murmured. His voice cracked on the word, but Rowan flicked an ear, listening. They started forward, just a walk at first. The drizzle painted the field in a sheen, drops gathering on Rowan's mane, sliding down Ethan's cheekbones. The horse's gait was cautious, uneven, but each step settled more sure than the last. Ethan kept his seat light, his hands gentle, remembering Olivia's warning, rhythm, not speed. With every lap around the field, the rhythm grew clearer, breath and stride, heartbeat and hooves. Ethan could feel it under him, through him, like the old language he thought he had forgotten. He let himself lean into it, not to control but to join. From the fence, Maya gasped. "He's doing it," she whispered, though the rain had soaked her voice to a whisper's edge. "You both are." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was too thick with something he couldn't name. Halfway through the second lap, Rowan's stride lengthened, unprompted. His ears went forward, his muscles loosening as if the drizzle had washed away fear. Ethan tightened his hold for a moment, instinct screaming caution. Then, with a shudder, he loosened it again, letting Rowan choose the pace. The horse surged, not into a gallop, but into a brisk, rolling trot that rocked Ethan's body in time. For a moment, the years peeled away. He was young again, wind in his hair, the world flying by in a blur. But this time, there was no crowd, no finish line, only the quiet applause of rain on earth, only the steady pulse of the animal beneath him. A sob broke loose before he could stop it. It was quiet, swallowed by the drizzle, but Maya saw the way his shoulders shook, the way his hand trembled on the reins. She pressed her lips together, holding back her own tears, not wanting to break the fragile spell. Rowan slowed of his own accord, chest heaving, nostrils flared. Ethan leaned forward, pressing his palm against the damp mane, his forehead almost touching the horse's neck. "Good," he whispered hoarsely. "Good boy." When he finally dismounted, his legs were unsteady, not from weakness but from the weight of what had just happened. Maya ran to him, her face flushed with pride. "Dad, that was enough," he cut in, though his voice was softer than his words. He handed her the reins, his gaze on the horizon where the rain blurred into mist. "It's enough for today." But as they led Rowan back to the barn, Ethan's chest still carried the rhythm, still echoed with the heartbeat he had felt through the saddle. It wouldn't leave him, no matter how much he tried to shake it. That night, as the rain deepened into a steady patter on the tin roof, Ethan lay awake in bed. He stared at the ceiling, hearing again the rhythm of hooves, feeling again the surge of motion beneath him. And though fear lingered, so did something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The drizzle had long since passed, leaving the fields lush and heavy with new green. By the end of the week, the sun returned, sharp and clear, painting Willow Bend in the kind of golden light that made even the most weathered barns look almost holy. The town itself seemed to hum with energy. Banners were being strung across Main Street, bright reds and blues snapping in the spring wind. The county fair was coming. Maya noticed the flyers first. She spotted one taped to the glass door of the feed store when she went to buy oats. The words leapt out at her. Bluegrass Revival Run, a community race for the rescue. Fund. Her heart thudded. She stood rooted to the sidewalk, rereading the flyer until the letters blurred. It wasn't just a race, it was a fundraiser, the kind of event meant to stir small towns like theirs into something bigger than themselves. She grabbed one of the extra slips from the counter and stuffed it into her pocket, her mind already racing faster than any horse on the track. That evening, she set the flyer on the kitchen table, right beside her father's plate. Ethan eyed it warily as he sat down, his fork hovering above the meatloaf. "What's this?" Maya's voice trembled with excitement. "It's a race at the county fair. Not like the professional tracks, just a community run. They're raising money for the rescue shelter. Dad, it's perfect." Ethan didn't touch the paper. He chewed slowly, his face unreadable. "We're not doing this." "Why not?" "Because it's foolish." His tone was sharp, but underneath it there was something more fragile, a kind of fear that Maya had begun to recognize. "Rowan can do it," she pressed. "You felt it the other day, didn't you? When you rode him, he's got it in him." Ethan set down his fork with a clatter. "He's not ready, and neither am I." Maya's eyes burned. "You're scared." The words hung in the air, daring him to deny them. He didn't. He only looked away, jaw tight, staring at the flyer as though it might bite. 2 days later, the announcement became the talk of the diner. Ruth Ann had taped one of the flyers to her chalkboard menu, right under the daily pie special. Farmers argued about who might enter, kids bragged about whose pony could outrun whose, and old men remembered the races of their youth. The air buzzed with nostalgia and anticipation. Ethan sat in the corner booth, sipping coffee he didn't taste. He could feel the eyes on him. People still remembered his glory days, no matter how much he wished they'd forget. Ruth Ann slid into the seat across from him, her apron dusted with flour. "You going to enter?" she asked bluntly. "No," he said. Her gaze didn't waver. "Why not?" "Because I've got no reason to." Ruth Ann leaned forward, lowering her voice. "That horse in your barn says otherwise." Ethan's hand tightened around his cup. He hated how easily she saw through him. Caleb appeared at the counter just then, dropping a handful of coins into the tip jar. "If you ask me," he said without looking over, "a man's got 2 choices when the past comes knocking. Bolt the door or open it." Ethan glared. "And if opening it burns the whole house down?" Caleb met his eyes for the first time. "Then at least you'll be standing in the ashes knowing you tried." The words lingered long after Ethan left the diner. He drove home in silence, Maya beside him clutching the flyer she had folded into neat squares, unfolding and folding it again. That night, while she slept, he sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper. The bold letters seemed to mock him, daring him to step into something he'd sworn he'd never touch again. He thought of the crowd, the track, the fall. He thought of Rowan, steadying beneath him in the rain. He thought of his daughter's eyes burning with belief. By dawn, the decision still tore at him. His hand trembled as he reached for the pen. He signed the entry form anyway, his name shaky but legible. When Maya found the paper on the table that morning, her breath caught. She looked at him, her face alight, and for the first time in years, he couldn't quite keep the corner of his mouth from lifting. "Don't make me regret it," he said gruffly. Maya threw her arms around him, her joy spilling into the small kitchen like sunlight breaking through clouds. Out in the barn, Rowan shifted in his stall, tossing his head as if sensing the change. A storm was brewing, not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who would soon test themselves against the dirt track of Willow Bend's county fair. The entry form had barely left Ethan's hands before word spread. Willow Bend was the kind of town where nothing stayed quiet for long. By the week's end, it wasn't just friends and neighbors whispering about the Cole name appearing on the county fair list. It was the whole county. Some were curious, some skeptical, and a few outright laughed at the thought of Ethan Cole, the washed-up farmer, riding again. Ethan ignored the talk as best he could, but it hung in the air like dust. Every trip into town brought sidelong glances, hushed comments. He carried himself as if it didn't matter, though inside his stomach knotted tighter with each passing day. It was late one afternoon when a black truck rolled down the gravel road to his farm, the kind of truck that gleamed even in mud, its chrome polished, its tires spotless. Ethan was fixing a broken fence post when the engine cut and a man stepped out, dressed in a tailored vest and a crisp shirt that didn't belong anywhere near a farm. "Ethan Cole," the man called, his voice smooth as whiskey. "Been a long time." Ethan squinted against the Sunday. "Vince Harrow." Vince walked with an easy confidence, the sort that came from money and the certainty that it opened doors. He had once been a fellow competitor on the circuit, though where Ethan had fallen, Vince had climbed using not just skill but sharp business and sharper elbows. He now owned a string of horses, a stable near Lexington, and a reputation for getting what he wanted. "I hear you've entered the fair," Vince said, leaning on the fence. "That true?" Ethan kept working, driving the post deeper into the earth. "That's my business." Vince smiled thinly. "So it island, but a man with your history stepping back onto the track, well, folks are bound to talk. You sure that's the kind of attention you want?" Ethan didn't answer. Vince let the silence stretch before he continued. "I saw that horse of yours. Rowan, is it? Thin, scarred, out of practice. You'd be better off selling him to someone who can make something of him. I could take him off your hands." "Generous price, no questions asked." The words hit like a slap. Ethan turned slowly, his face hard. "He's not for sale." Vince chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Everything's for sale, Cole. You of all people should know that. Farms don't run on pride, they run on money. You've got debts, I've got cash. Seems simple." From the porch, Maya had stepped out, clutching her sketchbook, her eyes narrowing. "We're not selling him," she said firmly. Vince's gaze flicked to her, then back to Ethan. "Stubborn runs in the family, I see. But stubborn doesn't pay the bank. Think about it, Ethan. You put that horse in the fair, you risk humiliation, maybe worse. You sell him to me, you get breathing room. A smart man takes the sure thing." Ethan felt the weight of the words settle on him. Pride and practicality waged war inside his chest. He had lain awake too many nights, calculating bills, staring at overdue notices, praying the roof would hold one more season. Vince's offer could ease that. It could even buy Maya a better life. But then he looked at her, standing fierce and unyielding on the porch, her hand resting against the railing as if she were anchoring herself to the house they had fought to keep. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire Ruth Ann had spoken of, the same fire he had once carried. And he knew. Rowan wasn't just a horse. He was the bridge between what Ethan had been and what Maya believed he could still become. Selling him would be more than giving up, it would be teaching his daughter to give up too. "I said he's not for sale," Ethan repeated, his voice low, steady. For the first time, Vince's smile faltered, his eyes narrowed, calculating. "Suit yourself. But when you're standing in the dust at that track, don't say I didn't offer you a way out." He tipped his hat, slid back into his spotless truck, and drove off, tires spitting gravel. Ethan stood still long after the sound of the engine faded. His hands ached from gripping the fence post too tight. Doubt pressed hard against his ribs. Vince wasn't wrong, the risk was real, the debts heavier than he could admit. For a moment, the temptation of escape had almost swallowed him. Maya came down the steps, her expression softening when she reached him. She laid her hand on his arm. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Ethan looked at her, at the conviction etched on her young face. He wished he believed it as fully as she did. That night, the farm felt heavier than usual. The creak of the rafters, the drip of water from the eaves, even the rustle of Rowan shifting in his stall seemed louder in the silence. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the flyer for the fair lying beside the unpaid bills. He rubbed his temples, caught between two truths, the dream that pulled at him and the weight that threatened to crush him. Temptation lingered like a shadow in the corner of the room, whispering that Vince's way would be easier. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Rowan's steady gaze, Maya's fierce belief, and something in his chest refused to let go. He blew out the lamp, leaving the house in darkness. Tomorrow, he would step back into the barn, and the fight would begin again, not just against the track, not just against Vince, but against the doubt that threatened to undo him. The days after Vince Harrow's visit felt heavier, as though his words had seeped into the soil of the farm itself. Ethan moved through chores like a man carrying weights in his pockets, his shoulders bent, his thoughts a tangle he couldn't shake. Even the rhythm of work, the feeding, the repairing, the hauling offered no relief. Every task was laced with the whisper of temptation he had nearly listened to. But Maya's belief did not waver. Each afternoon, she was out in the pasture with Rowan, coaxing him to move a little freer, brushing the mud from his coat, talking to him in the soft voice that seemed to steady them both. Her sketches piled up on the kitchen counter. Rowan's head bent to drink, the tilt of his ears in the wind, the line of his body against the open field. Ethan tried not to look, but he saw them anyway, and each one chipped at the walls he had built. One evening, after a long day of mending fence lines, Ethan lingered at the edge of the pasture instead of going inside. The sun was lowering, bleeding gold and crimson across the sky, painting the grass with fire. Maya was already there, leaning against the white rail, sketchbook open on her knee. Rowan stood close beside her, his dark coat shining in the last light, the small white star on his forehead catching the glow. Ethan walked over slowly, his boots crunching the dry earth. Maya glanced up, smiling faintly. "He likes the evenings best," she said. "It's when he relaxes." Rowan flicked an ear at Ethan's approach, then lowered his head back to the grass. The trust was tentative, but it was there. Ethan rested his arms on the fence, watching horse and daughter framed against the sunset. For a moment, something inside him loosened. "Let's try him out here," Maya suggested suddenly. Her eyes shone with that fire again. "Just a short run, nothing fast." Ethan hesitated. He could already hear Olivia's voice warning him not to push too soon. But Rowan looked steady tonight, the air calm, the ground dry enough. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan needed to feel it again, the movement, the rhythm, the memory of flight. He nodded once. "Bring the tack." Maya ran to fetch the bridle and saddle, her braid flying behind her. Ethan stepped into the pasture, laying a hand on Rowan's neck. The horse shifted slightly but didn't shy. His breath was slow, his body warm beneath Ethan's palm. "You ready for this?" Ethan murmured. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the horse or to himself. By the time Maya returned, the sky had deepened to a copper glow. Together they saddled Rowan, careful, deliberate. Ethan swung into the seat, his muscles remembering even as his mind resisted. Maya climbed onto the rail, watching intently. They started at a walk, circling the pasture's edge. Rowan's ears flicked forward, his stride cautious but steady. The evening air was cool against Ethan's face, the scent of grass sharp and alive. Slowly, he pressed Rowan into a trot. The horse obliged, hooves drumming softly against the earth. It wasn't fast, not yet, but it was something. Each stride carried them further from doubt, closer to trust. Ethan felt his body relax, the old rhythm stirring in his bones. He loosened the reins slightly, letting Rowan stretch into the motion. Maya clapped her hands from the fence. "Yes, that's it." Rowan lifted his head, responding to the sound, his trot lengthening into a smooth, rolling canter. Ethan's chest surged with a rush of heat, fear, and exhilaration colliding. He hadn't planned to go faster, but in that moment, it felt inevitable. The horse wanted it, and so did he. They cut across the center of the pasture, the sun blazing behind them, their shadows stretching long and wild across the grass. For a fleeting heartbeat, Ethan let go of every weight, the debts, the failures, the doubts. There was only the horse beneath him, the wind in his face, the fire of a dream he thought was dead. But as they rounded back toward the fence, Rowan stumbled slightly, his hoof catching on uneven ground. Ethan's breath hitched, instinct tightening his hands. The horse recovered quickly, but the jolt sent a spike of fear lancing through him. The memory of his fall years ago crashed in with brutal clarity, the snap of bone, the roar of the crowd gone silent. He pulled Rowan back to a walk, his pulse pounding, his throat dry. Maya hopped down from the rail, running to meet them. "He did so good, Dad. You both did." Ethan dismounted stiffly, his knees weak. He forced a nod, handing her the reins. "That's enough for tonight." Maya's face glowed with triumph, but Ethan couldn't shake the tremor in his hands. He stroked Rowan's damp neck once before turning toward the barn, the glow of the sunset now tinged with shadows. Later, as the last light drained from the sky, Ethan sat on the porch alone. From the pasture came the faint sound of Rowan's breath, steady and sure. Ethan closed his eyes, replaying the ride, the rush, the stumble, the fear. Hope and doubt warred inside him, neither willing to yield. But one truth was undeniable. The horse was ready to run. The only question was whether Ethan would be brave enough to let him. The week leading up to the fair carried the weight of a storm that hadn't yet broken. The fields shimmered under long afternoons, the air thick with humidity, cicadas buzzing like a fever. Ethan tried to hold on to the fragile progress he'd felt in the pasture, but fear clung to him like sweat. One stumble, one reminder of the past, and his chest tightened as though he were already falling again. Maya didn't see it that way. To her, Rowan's short canter beneath the sunset had been proof. Her father still had the fire, proof the horse could carry it. She filled the kitchen with new sketches, pinned them on the fridge, on the walls, until their small home seemed papered with visions of what could be. Ethan never told her to stop. He didn't have the heart. It was on a Friday evening when the sky darkened early, clouds massing low and heavy. Ethan and Maya led Rowan out for another session, wanting to keep the rhythm alive, to stretch his legs before the fair. The air was uneasy, charged with the kind of electricity that makes the hairs on your arms lift. Storms coming. Ethan muttered, glancing at the horizon. Just a little while, Maya pleaded. He needs it. They agreed on a short trot. Ethan mounted, settling into the saddle, Rowan shifting beneath him, ears twitching at the distant rumble. They circled the field once, twice, the horse's stride smooth, his breath even. Ethan tried to relax into it, to let the rhythm carry him, but his chest ached with unease. Then it came the first crack of thunder, sharp and sudden, splitting the sky. Rowan jolted, muscles locking, eyes going wide. Ethan tightened the reins, murmuring steady words, but another clap followed, louder, closer. Rowan exploded into panic. He surged forward, ears flat, hooves tearing at the wet earth. Ethan clung to the saddle, fighting for control, his voice drowned by the storm's roar. The horse veered toward the fence, skidding, then bolted sideways. For an instant, Ethan saw only blur the ground rushing up, the memory of his last fall flashing like lightning through his mind. "Maya!" he shouted as Rowan twisted beneath him. He hit the ground hard, pain flaring up his shoulder. Rowan reared, hooves slashing the air, then tore across the field, nostrils flaring, eyes wild. Maya screamed, dropping her sketchbook into the mud as she scrambled toward her father. "Dad!" Ethan rolled onto his side, breath ragged, vision spinning. His shoulder throbbed, but nothing felt broken. Still, the fear clawed deeper than the pain. He saw Rowan's trembling frame at the far end of the field, sides heaving, ears pinned in terror. The storm had cracked something open, not just in the horse, but in him. "I knew it," Ethan rasped, clutching his arm as Maya reached him. "I knew this was a mistake." "No," Maya insisted, her eyes wide with panic and determination. "He just got scared. You both did. But it doesn't mean—" "It means enough," Ethan snapped, louder than he intended. His voice cracked with more than pain. "I can't do this again. I won't." The words hung in the charged air, harsher than the thunder still rolling above them. Maya froze, rain dripping from her lashes, her mouth trembling as though she'd been struck. They got Rowan back into the barn with effort, the horse trembling, sweat and rain streaking his coat. Olivia arrived not long after, summoned by Maya's frantic call. She checked the horse carefully, her hands steady despite the storm still hammering the roof. "He's not injured," she said finally, "just shaken. But if you pull him out now, if you stop, it'll set him back." Ethan sat on a bale of hay, his arm cradled against his chest, his face pale. "I said it's over. He's not ready. I'm not ready." Maya's eyes brimmed with tears. "You don't trust him," she whispered. "You don't even trust yourself." Her words cut deeper than any fall. Ethan couldn't look at her. He stared instead at Rowan, who stood in the corner of the stall, sides still quivering, eyes wide and dark. They mirrored his own fear back at him, an echo he couldn't escape. When the storm finally passed, the air smelled of wet earth and broken promises. Maya sat silently on the porch, sketchbook ruined in her lap, pages curling from the rain. Ethan stood in the doorway, unable to speak, the distance between them wider than the whole pasture. Inside, the bills on the kitchen table lay untouched, but beside them the flyer for the fair still glared up, bold letters mocking him. For the first time since signing his name, Ethan wondered if Vince had been right. And in the barn, Rowan shifted uneasily, as if the thunder still lived inside his chest. The storm did not end with the thunder that had spooked Rowan. It lingered, stalking the valley with heavy clouds and sudden gusts of wind. By nightfall, the rain had returned, harder this time, hammering against the farmhouse windows, pouring through the gutters in silver streams. The roof creaked under the weight, the tin sheets rattling like they might peel away. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his shoulder still sore, his thoughts darker than the storm. The lamp beside him flickered with each gust, throwing shadows across the flyer for the fair that lay crumpled beside the stack of unpaid bills. He hadn't told Maya, but he'd almost decided tomorrow he'd withdraw. Better to stop now than risk breaking himself again, or worse, dragging his daughter into a dream doomed to fail. Maya didn't argue anymore. She had spent the evening upstairs, her door closed, her silence louder than shouting. Ethan almost preferred anger to the stillness that had settled between them. At least anger burned hot, silence was cold, suffocating. Then came the crack, a sound sharp as a gunshot split the night, followed by the groan of timber. Ethan bolted up, heart pounding. From outside, through the roar of rain, he heard it, the frantic whinny of a horse. Rowan. He grabbed his coat and shoved his boots on, stumbling into the storm. The wind slapped against him, rain blinding as he ran toward the barn. Lightning lit the sky, revealing the damage. Part of the roof had torn free, jagged tin sheets flapping wildly, rain pouring into the stalls. Rowan was trapped beneath the broken section, eyes wide, hooves striking against the flooded ground. "Easy, boy," Ethan shouted, though his own voice shook. He splashed through the mud, the storm drenching him to the bone in seconds. Rowan's panic filled the air, wild and raw. Every strike of his hooves threatened to injure him further. Ethan forced himself closer, raising his hands, his voice lowering despite the chaos around them. "It's all right. I'm here. You're not alone." For a heartbeat, Rowan's ears flicked toward him. His muscles trembled, ready to bolt, but the sound of Ethan's voice wove through the noise of the storm. Ethan stepped closer, slower, careful, his boots sinking deep into the muck. "Listen to me," he murmured, his tone steady now. "We walk together one step. Just one." Rowan's eyes rolled, whites flashing, but he didn't rear. Ethan extended a hand, letting the rain wash it clean. At last, Rowan lowered his head, nostrils flaring against Ethan's palm. The touch steadied them both. With slow, deliberate steps, Ethan led him away from the broken section, guiding him toward the far stall that was still intact. Each stride was a test of trust, the horse trembling, the man whispering with every step. When they finally reached safety, Ethan closed the gate, leaning heavily against it, his breath ragged. Rowan pressed close to the rail, his body quivering, but his eyes were different now. They weren't wild, not anymore. They held something Ethan hadn't seen before: belief. Maya appeared at the barn door, soaked and wide-eyed, clutching a lantern against the rain. "Dad," she cried. "He's safe," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist despite the mud and water. For the first time in days, Ethan let himself hold her, pressing his cheek to her wet hair. "I thought I lost him," she whispered. "So did I," he admitted. His voice broke, but there was no shame in it. They spent the rest of the night shoring up the barn as best they could, moving hay to the dry stalls, covering the exposed beams with tarps. Rowan stood quietly, watching them, his sides rising and falling with calmer breaths. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the fields drenched and shining in the pale morning light. The barn roof sagged where it had broken, but it still stood. Ethan leaned against the doorway, exhausted, soaked through, but something had shifted in him. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned him. He thought of the way Rowan had followed his voice, step by step, through the chaos. It wasn't control that had saved them, it was trust. Maya stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. She looked up at him with a quiet smile. "We can still do this," she said. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out at the storm-washed fields, the sun breaking through clouds, the white fences gleaming clean again. For the first time, the thought of racing didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with something else. "Maybe we can," he said softly. Behind them, Rowan nickered, low and steady, as if agreeing. The storm left more than broken shingles and flooded fields behind it, left a strange quiet, as though the land itself was holding its breath. For Ethan, the night in the barn had carved something open inside him. He hadn't forgotten the fear, but he'd discovered something stronger. Rowan had followed him through chaos, step by step, because of trust. That truth clung to him now like the smell of rain-soaked hay. The morning sun glinted off puddles as Maya ran barefoot across the yard, her laughter echoing in the clean air. She was already talking about repairs, about painting the barn once they patched the roof. Ethan watched her, a tired smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He hadn't seen her this light in weeks, but the fair loomed closer, only days away, and Ethan knew they couldn't waste time. That evening, he found Maya sketching on the porch steps, her pencil dancing across the page. He sat beside her, staring out at Rowan grazing near the fence line. "Tomorrow," Ethan said, his voice low. "We start again." Maya looked up sharply. "You mean?" "We don't stop now, not after what he showed us last night." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horse. "But we don't do it for winning. We do it for us, for him, for you." Her eyes shimmered. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, whispering, "We'll go together." The next days became a rhythm. Every morning, Ethan and Maya worked Rowan through steady laps, slow and deliberate. No pushing, no chasing speed. Olivia visited, checking his gait, reminding them to balance training with rest. Caleb stopped by too, his rough hands adjusting the saddle straps, his quiet eyes approving without words. "Funny thing about horses," Caleb muttered once as he ran a hand along Rowan's flank. "They'll forgive quicker than most men." Ethan only grunted, though inside he felt the truth of it. Rowan had forgiven his hesitation, his fear, even his shouting. Now it was Ethan's turn to forgive himself. Each session drew them closer, not just man and horse, but father and daughter. Maya's laughter filled the fields, her encouragement pushing Ethan when his doubts threatened to return. Sometimes she rode alongside on the old pony from Ruth Ann's farm, her braid flying, her voice carrying across the pasture. Other times she stood at the fence, clapping, cheering, sketching the sight of her father riding again. Ethan began to notice the small things, the way Rowan's stride smoothed out when he relaxed, the way his breathing matched Ethan's when they moved as one, the way fear in his own chest loosened each time he trusted the reins less and his instincts more. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ethan dismounted after a clean, steady run. He stroked Rowan's neck, the horse blowing warm breath against his hand. Maya ran up, her cheeks flushed. "You smiled," she said, breathless. "What?" "Just now. When you were riding, you smiled." Ethan opened his mouth to deny it, but the truth was in her eyes. He had smiled, and the realization startled him. It felt foreign, like an old coat he hadn't worn in years but still fit. That night, they sat on the porch with Ruth Ann, who had brought a pie to celebrate the patched roof. She listened to Maya chatter about the training, her eyes crinkling with pride. When Ethan grew quiet, Ruth Ann nudged him gently. "You know, sometimes it's not about getting back what you lost," she said. "Sometimes it's about finding what was waiting all along." Ethan didn't answer, but he let the words settle. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the lanterns blown out, he returned to the barn alone. Rowan lifted his head at the sound of footsteps, ears pricking forward. Ethan stepped into the stall, resting a hand on the horse's withers. "No more running from it," he whispered. "We go together now, no matter what comes." Rowan nudged his shoulder with a soft nicker, and Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the vow settle in his chest. The fair was coming. The crowd, the noise, the track, they would all test him. But tonight, in the quiet barn, with the smell of hay and horse sweat thick in the air, he felt ready in a way he hadn't in years. The morning of the fair broke bright and sharp, the kind of Kentucky day that seemed carved from glass. The sky stretched high and blue, the air still cool with dew. By the time the sun climbed over the hills, Willow Bend was already alive with color and noise. Banners rippled along Main Street, booths crowded with pies, preserves and quilts, and the air rang with fiddle tunes and children's laughter. For Ethan, the morning felt heavier than the storm had. His boots struck the ground with deliberate weight as he led Rowan through the crowded fairgrounds. The horse's dark coat shone after days of grooming, his mane neatly trimmed, the small white star on his forehead catching the light. Maya walked beside them, her braid swinging, her hand brushing Rowan's flank like she was guiding them both. The racetrack lay at the far end of the fair, encircled by wooden rails painted white but chipped from years of use. The dirt had been freshly turned, soft underfoot, the scent of earth mixing with fried dough and kettle corn. Stands had been set up along the rail, already filling with neighbors, farmers, and strangers from nearby towns. Ethan felt every eye on him. He heard the whispers his name carried on the wind like a ghost. "That's Cole. Thought he'd quit. What's he doing?" "Back here." He kept his jaw set, his gaze fixed ahead. Ruth Ann waved from the stands, her apron traded for a bright Sunday dress. Caleb leaned on the rail near the paddock, arms folded, giving Ethan a single steady nod. Olivia was there too, clipboard in hand, her expression sharp, but her eyes softer than usual. He wasn't alone, though the weight in his chest made him feel like it. Then Vince Harrow appeared. His polished boots gleamed, his shirt crisp, his smile as sharp as a blade. He stood beside his own horse, a sleek chestnut that stamped the ground with restless energy. Vince's eyes met Ethan's, mocking and cool. "Still time to back out," Vince drawled. "No shame in knowing your limits." Ethan didn't answer. Maya did. She lifted her chin and said, clear enough for the bystanders to hear, "We don't quit." Vince's smile flickered, but only for a moment. He tipped his hat and led his horse toward the start. The announcer's voice carried over the grounds, calling the riders to line up. Ethan swung into the saddle, his body tense, his shoulders still sore from the fall days ago. Rowan shifted beneath him, ears flicking at the noise, but his body felt strong, steadier than ever. Ethan leaned down, whispering into the horse's ear, "Just you and me, boy. One breath at a time." The crowd roared as the riders moved into place. Farmers on sturdy quarter horses, young men on borrowed geldings, and Vince at the far side, his horse gleaming like a polished coin. Ethan adjusted the reins, feeling the familiar leather against his palms. The flag dropped. The track erupted in sound, hoofs pounding, dust flying, voices shouting. Ethan held Rowan back at first, letting him find the rhythm, the breath. Around the first bend, two riders surged ahead, Vince close behind them. The crowd shouted, cheering names, calling bets. Maya's voice cut through, high and fierce. "Go, Dad. You've got this." Rowan's ears flicked, his stride lengthening. Ethan let him ease forward, step by steady step, until they were running just behind the leaders. The wind tore at his shirt, the dirt stung his face, but he felt the rhythm beneath him, breath and heartbeat, stride and pulse. Halfway through, Vince glanced back, smirking as his chestnut surged ahead. Ethan tightened his jaw, whispering low, "Not yet. Wait." Rowan obeyed, his muscles coiled, his breath steady. Around the final bend, Ethan loosened the reins. The horse stretched out, hooves eating the ground, the world narrowing to dust and thunder. They surged forward, passing one rider, then another. The crowd roared. Ethan heard nothing but the rhythm: inhale, exhale, heartbeat, hoofbeat. For the first time, he wasn't riding against fear. He was riding with trust. At the final stretch, Vince was just ahead, his chestnut straining, foam at its mouth. Ethan leaned low over Rowan's neck, whispering, "Now," Rowan answered. He surged with a strength Ethan hadn't felt before, his stride opening, his breath a drumbeat against the air. They pulled even with Vince, dust flying, the crowd on their feet. For a heartbeat, time slowed, the memory of his old fall flashing, the fear of breaking again. But then he looked down, saw Maya at the rail, her hands cupped around her mouth, her eyes blazing with belief. The fear loosened, the trust held. They crossed the line neck and neck with Vince, the roar of the crowd swelling into a storm of cheers. Ethan pulled Rowan up, chest heaving, dust streaking his face. He didn't know yet who had won. He didn't care. For the first time in years, the fire inside him wasn't buried. It was alive, burning, and it wasn't about victory, it was about coming home. The world seemed to hold its breath as the riders slowed, dust hanging in the air like smoke. Ethan's lungs burned, his body shook, but his heart thundered with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Rowan's sides heaved beneath him, sweat darkening his mahogany coat, the white star on his forehead streaked with dirt. Yet the horse's eyes gleamed not with fear, but with fire. The announcer's voice cracked over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a photo finish." The grandstand erupted. Neighbors cheered, children climbed the rails, old men shouted wagers they hadn't meant to make. Ethan sat tall, breathing hard, watching the officials huddle over the strip of film, their brows furrowed. He had thought he would dread this moment, the suspense, the waiting, but instead, he felt calm. The victory had already happened inside him, the instant he had leaned into trust instead of fear. Still, the tension hummed. Beside him, Vince Harrow circled his chestnut, a scowl twisting his polished composure. "Fluke," he muttered, loud enough for Ethan to hear. "One lucky run doesn't change who you are." Ethan met his eyes. "You're right," he said evenly. "It changed who I was." Before Vince could answer, the announcer raised his hand. "By the width of a nose, Rowan and Ethan Cole take it." The crowd exploded. Maya's scream pierced through the roar as she leapt up and down at the rail, her sketchbook clutched to her chest, tears streaking her face. Ruth Ann waved her handkerchief, shouting his name, while Caleb tipped his hat with a quiet, satisfied nod. Olivia clapped once, sharply, her smile small but proud. Ethan dismounted slowly, his knees trembling as his boots hit the dirt. Maya pushed through the crowd and flung herself into his arms, nearly knocking the breath from him. "You did it! You did it!" He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, the roar of the crowd fading to a hum around them. "No," he whispered, voice rough. "We did." Rowan stood beside them, head lowered, nostrils flaring, but calm, steady. Ethan rested a hand against the horse's damp neck, feeling the pulse still strong beneath the skin. "You carried me home," he murmured, his throat tight. Reporters from the local paper swarmed, shoving questions, snapping photos. Ethan answered little, letting the noise wash over him. The only image he cared about was Maya's shining eyes and the horse who had given him back his breath. Vince stormed off, his chestnut tugging at the reins, but Ethan barely noticed. The real finish line wasn't the strip of dirt they'd crossed, it was here, in this moment, with his daughter in his arms and a horse who had reminded him of who he could be. As the fair carried on, music rising, ribbons awarded, pies sold, Ethan, Maya, and Rowan walked slowly back toward the barn. Strangers stopped to shake his hand. Children reached out to touch Rowan's mane. Neighbors clapped him on the back. Ethan accepted it all with quiet humility, but he didn't let go of Maya's hand, nor the reins in his other. When they reached the quiet of the stalls, Maya touched the small blue ribbon pinned to her father's shirt. This is just the start, isn't it? Ethan looked at her, at Rowan, at the sunlight filtering through the slats. He thought of the nights he'd nearly quit, the debts that still waited, the fear that hadn't fully gone. But he also thought of the trust built step by step, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. "No," he said softly. "This isn't the start. This is the heart of it. The rest we'll find together." Maya smiled through her tears, resting her head against Rowan's shoulder. The horse nickered softly, the sound filling the barn like a promise. For Ethan, the finish line hadn't been about winning, it had been about crossing from fear into faith, from silence into trust, from loss into love. And as the fairground lights flickered on outside, he knew he had finally reached it. The fair faded into memory over the next few days, but its echo lingered everywhere in Willow Bend. At the diner, Ruth Ann told the story of the photo finish to anyone who would listen, her hands cutting the air with drama. At the feed store, farmers debated whether Rowan's stride had been bred or built. Children drew pictures of horses in chalk on the sidewalks, their lines clumsy but filled with joy. For Ethan, the noise was background. What stayed with him wasn't the ribbon, or even the roar of the crowd, but the quiet moment afterward, the weight of Maya in his arms, the feel of Rowan's heartbeat beneath his palm. That was the victory. And it followed him home like a steady flame. The farm still bore its scars. The barn roof sagged where the storm had torn it, though the tarps kept the rain at bay. The fields were rough, some fences still leaning, and the bills still piled on the table, stubborn reminders that one race hadn't erased reality. But Ethan no longer faced those truths with the hollow eyes of defeat. He faced them with the strength of someone who had found his footing again. One evening, as the light bent gold across the fields, neighbors began arriving in trucks and on tractors. Caleb carried his tools, Olivia a box of supplies, Ruth Ann a basket of food enough to feed an army. Word had spread that the Coles needed help, and in small towns, word became action. "We can't pay you," Ethan started, embarrassed. Ruth Ann waved him off. "No one's asking. You gave us something to believe in again, Ethan Cole. Let us give a little back." By dusk, hammers rang, ladders creaked, voices echoed. The roof took shape again under many hands, stronger than before. Lanterns glowed in the twilight, casting long shadows as neighbors worked and laughed. Maya stood among them, her cheeks flushed, her sketchbook capturing scenes of resilience, a child passing shingles to her father, Caleb balanced against the sky, Rowan grazing calmly in the pasture as though he knew the farm was being healed. Ethan worked too, sweat mixing with gratitude. For years he had carried the weight alone, convinced he had nothing left to offer. But as he looked around at the people who refused to let him fall, he felt something rise in his chest. Hope wasn't just his daughter's dream anymore, it was shared. When the last nail was driven and the last lantern dimmed, the barn stood whole again. Ethan walked inside, breathing deep, the smell of new wood mingling with hay. Rowan lifted his head from the stall, ears pricked. Ethan stepped close, running a hand along the horse's neck. "This is your home now," he whispered. "Ours, together." Rowan leaned into the touch, a low nicker vibrating through the quiet. Maya joined them, slipping her hand into her father's. "He gave us back more than a roof," she said softly. Ethan looked at her, at the girl who had dragged him out of silence, who had believed when he couldn't. "No," he said gently. "You did." She smiled, her eyes shining in the lantern glow. Weeks later, when the farm had settled into rhythm again, Ethan saddled Rowan not for a race, but for a ride across the hills. Maya walked beside them, sometimes sketching, sometimes just laughing at the way the wind tugged her braid. The path wound through open meadows, where wildflowers bent in the breeze, and along ridges where the whole valley spread out below. At the crest of one hill, Ethan paused, Rowan standing tall beneath him, The land rolled out like an endless sea of green, the fences white against the horizon, the sky vast and forgiving. He breathed deep, letting the moment fill him. For the first time, he didn't see what he had lost. He saw what he had: a daughter, a horse, a community, a home for dreams he'd thought were gone. He looked down at Maya, who was sketching furiously, her face lit by the fading Sunday. "What are you drawing now?" he asked. She smiled without looking up. "The way you look when you're finally free." Ethan's throat tightened. He turned Rowan toward the valley, the wind rising to meet them. As they descended, the world seemed wide open, every step a promise. The race had ended, but the journey was only beginning, and this time they would walk it together. And now, I want to hear from you. If Rowan's story touched your heart, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. It means more than you know. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next stories of courage, love, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals are waiting right around the corner.